I think there are so many examples of tech leaders pointing to specific works of science fiction. I think a lot of them do go as far as say gave them the idea for whatever thing they ended up inventing. So I think Steve Jobs said that about Asimov's work. I think Elon Musk said it about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is one that's a little bit harder for me to wrap my head around.
Yeah, I was going to say that maybe if you're writing stories like that, you can almost think of yourself as being like part of a portfolio of other science fiction writers, like in this case of like, look, I'm going to contribute to this medium. And then one of the 1,000 of us doing work in this area is maybe going to like influence the right people. And it probably won't be me, but I'm still in a sense contributing because you're like expanding the space of, possible things people could run into.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. And also because of the need for repeated exposures to out there ideas, you might not be moving the needle entirely by yourself. And I actually don't think that's entirely different from people in most industries trying to have a positive impact on the world. It can feel more speculative with works of fiction or other forms of storytelling, but I'm not actually sure that it is.
Hi, listeners. This is Luisa Rodriguez, one of the hosts of the 80,000 Hours podcast. In today's episode, my colleague Keiran Harris talks with Elizabeth Cox about whether storytelling can be a force for good in the world. TV shows and movies get the most airtime in the interview, as that's what Elizabeth's production company has been working on lately and where Keiran has focused most of his own creative writing energy. But they also cover novels, short stories, creative nonfiction, and even advice columns. Specifically, they talk about the existing empirical research for the impact of storytelling, their competing takes on the merits of thinking carefully about target audiences, whether stories can really change minds on deeply entrenched issues, or whether writers need to have more modest goals, whether humans will stay relevant as creative writers with the rise of powerful AI models, whether you can do more good with an overtly educational show versus other approaches, Elizabeth's new 5-part animated TV show Ada, including why she chose the topics of civilizational collapse, kidney donations, artificial wombs, AI, and gene drives, Keiran's idea for a long-termist Christmas movie, and much more. For me, this was a really fun episode to listen to. I was just totally engaged and engrossed throughout, despite not being particularly interested in storytelling as a topic coming into it. So I hope you enjoy it too. All right, without further ado, I bring you Keiran Harris and Elizabeth Cox.
Today I'm speaking with Elizabeth Cox. Elizabeth is the founder of Should We Studio, an independent production company dedicated to projects that will raise awareness of the most important issues facing humanity. Before that, she was the senior editorial producer at TED Ed, where she wrote and edited the scripts for over 200 educational animated videos on all sorts of subjects, which to date have hundreds of millions of views and more than 10,000 years of watch time. She also graduated from Brown University. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so to start off with, why should anyone believe us when we claim that writing stories could be a genuinely good option for a high-impact career?
Yeah, I think sort of the biggest and most important way is that stories get new issues and new ways of thinking about those issues into the public consciousness that weren't before, which is essential to making progress on anything. So I think climate change is kind of a good yardstick for everything else, and the case for how stories and films and books got that into the public consciousness, and also like the life cycle of going from niche to mainstream to partisan to ubiquitous and kind of back to nonpartisan is a really interesting life cycle for an issue. But in general, I think stories are the way we shift the Overton window. So widen the range of things that are acceptable and palatable, acceptable for policy and palatable to the public, which is, I think, kind of like almost by definition, a lot of things that are going to be really important and shape the future are not in the Overton window because they sound weird and off-putting and, very futuristic. But so yeah, I think stories are the best way to bring them in.
Yeah, no, I love it. we're about to get into all of that, but a classic final question that I wrote for the 80,000 Hours podcast is, if you just had to completely change careers and you somehow became totally indifferent to making the world a better place, what would be the most self-indulgent or most enjoyable career for you to pursue instead? And for me, writing TV shows and movies would be that. That would be my answer if I was asked that. So I'm wondering if you and I should be a little bit suspicious if we have this like shared opinion that storytelling can be great, and at the same time, it's exactly our dream job. If in fact it is your dream job.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally my dream job, and we should definitely be suspicious. Short answer. I think for me also, it was a very direct switch from I was pre-med, I was planning to be a doctor who paints on the side, and I made the switch from that to like, I'm going to make cartoons. I should definitely be suspicious of my motives there. And I think also when I first started learning about EA, I was like, oh, at last, a justification for my choice not to become a doctor. Too many, smart, empathetic people are competing for it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't make any marginal difference if I do it. So yeah, definitely cause to be suspicious. But on the other hand, I think people who pursue creative careers actually have to examine their motives for doing so a lot more than most people. Because if you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, management consultant, the peanut gallery of like aunties and neighbors and parents and all that is just like, great, good for you. Sounds good. Whereas if you're doing something creative or artistic, there's a lot of like, ooh, are you sure about that? It's kind of no secret that these careers are not particularly lucrative or stable. And also the early years of them, there's not like these sort of milestones that you can see where it's like, okay, I'm making progress towards the goal of becoming what I want to become. It's a lot of low paid, low status, boring work at first. And it can be really unclear if it's progressing in the right direction until, suddenly something shifts and you get a good opportunity. So I think there's a lot of, let's say, opportunities for self-reflection and assessing whether this is really the thing to do.
Yeah. Do we have solid empirical evidence about the potential impact of storytelling? Do we have papers, studies, experiments that'll give us like something for like, effective altruism people to look at and be like, oh yeah, that checks out? Yeah,
so some. And I think, it's worth saying up front that there are a couple things that make this difficult. One is that all of them are psychology or social science studies. And so none of them are impeccable.
So may not replicate.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing is, I'm not sure this is something people are generally aware of, but even as a filmmaker or someone whose work ends up somewhere like Netflix where it's getting seen by tons of people, you're not going to have any data on that. Like the data available to you is basically the data that's available to the public, which is basically nothing. It's like not even view count for most things except for, the top 5 ever. So those are the two things I would say up front. But that being said, there are some kind of all right studies. Basically, I think that this theory of change, of bringing things into the public consciousness, that sort of relies on the premise that the more times people see something, the more likely they are to be sympathetic to it or think it's not weird or whatever, right? Which sounds very basic and intuitive, but we should, investigate that premise, right? So there are a couple kind of psychological phenomena that are kind of relevant to this, but I think one that's especially helpful is this idea. It's called the mere exposure effect, which is basically that repeated exposures to certain portrayals make people positively inclined towards them, or even if they're completely novel things and ideas. So like this is something that's like so old and so extensively studied that most of the recent studies on it are like little pieces of it. But for example, showing stalking and other kind of emotionally abusive behaviors negatively in films makes people more inclined to view them negatively in real life and not like romantic or whatever. And similarly, depictions of mental illness that are kind of accurate but not scary or fear-mongering and sort of humanizing have a similar effect where they shift people's perceptions on that. So there's a lot of examples like that. Those are just a few. And I think there's enough that we can be pretty confident that like this idea of de-weirding is credible, which is good. You got to start somewhere. And then looking at climate change and environmentalism and some of the history there, I think are some of the best examples. And there's kind of no example bigger than an inconvenient truth, right? So there are a bunch of studies done to try to assess the impact of an inconvenient truth. And a couple that are kind of interesting, again, problems with all of these, but they're decent. One was looking at carbon offsets in the US in zip codes, like within 10 miles of a theater that was screening An Inconvenient Truth. And then the control group was ones further away, and like whether that increased. And they found that it did. And of course, you can think of a lot of things that are confounding there, right? But a lot of them are actually still related to the impact of the film. So, it's pretty good. And then another one that I think is kind of interesting and helpful and maybe more useful to people who are trying to assess the impact of their own media and stories and things was to analyze like mentions of An Inconvenient Truth as sort of a proxy for impact for how much it got into the public consciousness and zeitgeist. So basically what the study did is it was an analysis of the climate change threat index, which is basically assessing the overall perception of climate change in the US. And they took mentions of An Inconvenient Truth in the New York Times as sort of a way of measuring the zeitgeist, not just like, oh, it's released, it's out in the world, but it's still getting awards, it's still getting talked about, it's still getting debated, and actually found that it was the third most significant predictor of change in the climate change threat index from 2002 to 2010, which is kind of crazy, but very cool, I thought. And I think that idea of choosing something like mentions in the New York Times, I mean, adjust as needed for your thing, to use when you either don't have data like views or retention, or you're trying to assess something beyond what that information can tell you, is kind of cool and useful and helpful.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, it just made me think that there's like one path to the storytelling impact of like An Inconvenient Truth where it's like you just get into the public consciousness, and this is just you have this like very small impact on so many people that you end up having a big impact. And then kind of the opposite of that, which I think has also been true at least a couple of times, is having a big impact with just the right person or like small group of people. So like the one that stands out to me is apparently President Reagan, having watched the day after this like TV movie on nuclear war that like had a crazy amount of viewers in the 80s. He apparently watched that, was so horrified that he completely updated on this topic of how important it was. And yeah, in a way that I'm sure the people who were making it did not have this like as an ambition. They were probably seeking it being more like An Inconvenient Truth of like, hey, we just need to like update everyone's public consciousness a bit. But then you end up getting to the president of the United States and then have this like crazy impact. I don't know if you've like heard of other examples like that.
Yeah, one really similar one, I think, is with Nixon and the Andromeda Strain, which is a novel by Michael Crichton, who also wrote Jurassic Park, just totally updating his views on bioweapons as a threat worth taking seriously based on reading that book. And then I think there are a ton of examples, and I don't know, I'm always a tiny bit skeptical of when people are pointing to the things that most influence them, because I don't know. Did they really? But I think there are so many examples of sort of tech leaders like pointing to specific works of science fiction that I think a lot of them do go as far as say gave them the idea for whatever thing they ended up inventing. But I treat that with a little bit of skepticism. So I think like Steve Jobs said that about Asimov's work. I think Elon Musk said it about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is one that's a little bit harder for me to wrap my head around. But yeah. Yeah,
I was going to say that like because it's very hard to predict, like Hitchhikers, it's a good example. Where it's like maybe they wouldn't expect this. Maybe if you're writing stories like that, you can almost think of yourself as being like part of a portfolio of like other science fiction writers, like in this case of like, look, I'm going to just contribute to this like this medium, and then one of the 1,000 of us doing work in this area is maybe going to like influence the right people, and it probably won't be me, but I'm still in a sense contributing because you're like expanding the space of like, you know, possible like things people could run into.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it, and also because of the need for repeated exposures to out there ideas, that's also sort of related to that. You know, you might not be moving the needle entirely by yourself. And I actually don't think that's entirely different from people in most industries trying to have a positive impact on the world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it feels sort of more, it can feel more speculative and hand-wavy with works of fiction or other forms of storytelling, but I'm not actually sure that it is.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great point because, yeah, if you are someone who starts a maternal health charity in sub-Saharan Africa, you may think you only have like a 20% chance of this working out and having a big impact, but you should do it anyway, because if you get enough people who are willing to like make these bets, then eventually, ones will pay off. And, collectively, the thing that really should matter, at least, is just like good being done in the universe. And the more we can kind of get past this thing of like, it needs to be me being the one having the impact, I think the world's going to be better for that. And I think it's fair to apply that to storytelling, actually, is that, okay, yeah, maybe it is only 1 in 100 of these stories that have this big impact. But if the impact of that 100th story is big enough, then it can kind of like, I don't know, pay for the rest of us in a way, where it's like, it's kind of like, I don't know, like a VC firm who like invest in 100 different companies. It's like sort of the successful ones sort of pay for the other ones.
Yeah,
and
it's definitely going to be a bit hits-based.
yeah, exactly. You could just be like, yeah, this is just storytelling is just a hits-based thing, but that doesn't mean it's not high impact and expectation.
Yeah.
Do we know anything about if certain approaches seem to work better? We just talked about sci-fi, but like, comedy versus like romance versus like darker stuff. Do we have like any, empirical evidence on this kind of thing?
So not empirical evidence. I have ideas. But I think, actually, this is something we've tried to look into for various funding proposals and things at various points over the past few years. And there are studies on it, but they are kind of, everything we found was sort of too specific to be useful, like talking about really specific approaches to storytelling in a really specific context. And I don't think there's anything more meta or generalizable, at least not that we could find. Maybe someone's doing it as we speak. I hope so. It's one of my white whales.
Makes sense. I was wondering if, do you have anything that stands out to you as a show or a movie where you didn't know much about a topic and then you felt like it was this very informative experience?
Yeah, so there's one film that sort of stands out above all the rest, and it's an indie animated short film, which is my like all-time favorite medium, and it's called World of Tomorrow. It came out in 2015, and the premise is like fairly basic. Basically, a little girl gets visited by a clone from the future, like several generations ahead, who's trying to retrieve a memory from her that's gotten sort of lost in the iterations of replicating her mind. So not like a wild concept, but excellent execution. And at the time, I hadn't really thought about the ethics around emerging technologies at all. And it really just switched a flip for me. I left watching it just like mind blown, thinking through, arguing with the film in my head and all the, I don't know if I agree with this, I don't agree with that. I just having that sort of expansive mind feeling of there's so much more I could learn about this. And I think I trace starting Should We Studio and sort of the reasoning behind the choices I made to make the series we made, Ada, and to make it the way we did. I trace that kind of back to that, and I trace my interest in tech ethics back to that. And, it's just like a goofy little 10-minute short film with stick figures, but it was just beautiful and mind-blowing, so.
Yeah, that's great. And so what were the next steps from that point? So you watch the movie, you start arguing with yourself about it. Yeah, what happens then?
So I think this kind of relates to how I think storytelling can be impactful. I think it's pretty rare for one thing to do it all the way, right? I think something can change your mind, but how many times have we had our mind changed about something and not done anything about it? So it usually takes another push from another piece of media later. But for me, the first way it manifested was a few years later. I was working for TED Ed, and I was able to pitch educational videos on a wide range of subjects. And one of the areas I was particularly interested in was these sort of speculative technologies and the actual obstacles to making them a reality. So I worked on one that was like about how we find out, like experiments we can do to find out whether the universe is a simulation. And then the one that sort of really got me thinking back to some of the stuff World of Tomorrow had started for me, and eventually to starting my own studio and making the series was it was about whole brain emulation, but it was about like what are the technical obstacles to making this a reality. So very much on the can we end of things rather than the should we end of things. But through the process of making that, I found myself more interested in the ethical side of like, oh, is this a good idea? Like, what would we have to do to make this go well? And it was another few years before I did any of this, but I kind of couldn't let it go after that, I guess. And then I think the final push for me came from reading The Precipice in early 2020. And it kind of just pulled together all the strings of these things I'd been muddling on for years. And then that was like, the kick to finally make the leap. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's cool. But it sounds like it's very plausible that if you didn't have that initial experience with the story, you may never have found The Precipice.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that initial film, it also sort of helped me recognize a lot of recurring themes that are interesting to me, like unintended consequences, especially of choices we don't realize we're making, and tensions between individual and collective that are sort of central to the work I do now. And I think central to what drew me to some of the ideas in EA and The Precipice and things like that.
Yeah, nice. I've got a few things in this category where Dr. Strangelove was one for me, where it does pretty accurately cover the absurdity of nuclear warfare. And then The Pianist was one for me as well, for the Holocaust. I mean, Schindler's List would do a similar thing, but like it's asking a lot of someone to watch like an 8-hour documentary on the Holocaust. But if you watch a really brilliant film, you're going to get a lot there. And then one that stood out to me was 12 Angry Men. So a movie in the 50s made about one person on a jury who's like a holdout, and 11 people want to convict straight away. And the whole movie is set in the deliberation room. But that started to me because, as far as I know, you can't film a documentary of a jury deliberating. That's not a thing. So in every like true crime doc or something that's about like a jury case, you have to interview them after the fact. And so that was one where I'm like, oh, it's actually possible for fiction, for a movie in this case, to show you something that you can't see otherwise. Someone can have this experience and tell you something that's, actually pretty relevant for the criminal justice system. The story about, well, people are just so judgmental straight away, and they don't really look at evidence, and you'd like to think it's all like, it's all this like very careful, rational reasoning, but maybe people just like don't like the defendant.
Yeah, for sure. I think those are all really good examples.
Do you have a take for how long you think humans will stay relevant as creative writers, given the rise of large language models like GPT and Claude?
Nope. Yeah.
Nope.
I think no. I think that. I mean, longer answer. I think this question combines two things we are very bad at, which is, predicting how technologies will shape even the near future, and predicting what we ourselves are going to do in the near or longer term future. So I really have no idea.
Yeah, no, that's very fair. I guess, I'm getting at how we think, creative writing might stand up versus even other writing jobs maybe. But especially it feels to me like the prospects for writers are a bit worse than for visual artists, because there's definitely something to be said that people want to go to a museum, or an art gallery, and it does seem like they have this strong preference for it to be like, well, a human made that thing. If you go and print out a bunch of Mid-Journey AI photos that are like really beautiful, and you put them on canvases and you put them in an art gallery, maybe the first time someone does that, it's kind of interesting, but generally it seems like that's not super appealing. But I wonder if once GPT-7 or whatever can write at the the level of someone who's writing a show for Netflix, because it's so hidden already, and it's not like screenwriters are typically like celebrities either. It's a bit different in the theater. If you're a playwright in the theater, you really are kind of like the main person. But for TV shows and films, it's like, for fans, they want to know who the screenwriter is, but it's a little bit more hidden. So I wonder if it's and obviously it's just pure speculating, like anyone at this point. But I wonder if, that's the kind of thing that might, not hang around much beyond the point where you can just sort of objectively say, like, the best script written last year was written by an AI rather than a human.
Yeah. I think that's like probably a more productive way of thinking about it than trying to make a judgment on whether AI has better written or visual capabilities now. Yeah. So I think I don't know, a lot of TV shows are also kind of already garbage.
Oh yeah. Well,
Yeah,
I was
like-
gonna say that too. That like, if you went through Netflix, all the movies and TV shows, and were like, what percentage do you think are well written? It's like already a pretty
Yeah.
small percentage. And I gotta tell you, I think already the cutting edge LLMs could probably take a bunch of those jobs.
Interestingly, right now, because some of this stuff is so rigidly formulaic, I have found in my own experiments it to be worse at structural things than like sentence level writing, which is kind of interesting. But who knows how that'll change. I guess I think your good point about people's like strong preference for something to be made by humans is a good one, but I do think there's a chance it'll apply to some forms of written craft. Like when you think about the fact that people really love having books as physical objects in their houses, even though, we can read all the books on our phones now. And that's a little bit different because one of the things I love so much about the writing is that it isn't attached to a physical object, it's like this fundamental unit of story that can be transmitted freely. Like you don't have to be able to go to a museum to see it. But I do think knowing something was written by a human might still carry some kind of weight for people if that's something people continue to care about. It's also kind of interesting for me because the whole notion of something being handmade is not something I super care about as a consumer.
Yeah.
But obviously it would be cool for me if people did continue to care about it.
Yeah, totally. I have the same sort of take where it's if I'm being honest, if you give me season 8 of Mad Men, so there are only 7 seasons that were made, and it's as good. It just is as good, and it's exactly what I would have expected if the original crew got together and made it. I bet I get over it pretty quickly in terms of my enjoyment. Like I don't think I'd be like, I don't find this compelling anymore. I suppose at least initially you might even have some slight preference because it's just fascinating that we're like in the presence of this magic box that can do something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is probably the same thing where you just won't have no idea. But yeah, does this come up for you when you're thinking about like your long-term career? Thinking like, what do I want to be doing in 10, 15 years? And do you want to make creative nonfiction? Do you want to, write novels? Do you want to make movies? And do you start to think like, what if like GPT-6 is just so good that the prospects of that just go way down because then you can get comparable quality writing for, 3 cents?
Yeah. I mean, emotionally, I definitely, so emotionally what I feel is I got to execute all my best ideas as quickly as possible while it still matters that I'm the person doing them. And that like, I hope AI doesn't replace people in creative things, but I don't think that's necessarily rational or even in my self-interest. If, AI is going well and making things great, like that would be good for me. Like, would I rather keep writing novels or have every disease be cured? I mean, emotionally, I would rather keep writing novels. Yeah.
No, it's like, and it's very, very human of you to think that. And maybe this is easier for me to think about because currently my job is being, running this podcast, not doing creative writing. And for me, if you told me like, in a year, GPT-5 is just going to be the best podcast producer and manager and whatever the hell I do every day, it's better at everything. Well, then I could actually be like, oh, great, I get to like just write then, and maybe it's better at writing novels and maybe it's better at writing movies too. But I just love writing, and so it doesn't actually feel too scary to me, as long as obviously a lot has to go right for the world to be okay. But putting it to aside, just say like it's a good future. It's closer to these at least positive futures, if not utopias. But that one doesn't strike me as being terrible personally, but it does make sense that because you've already managed to do this professionally, is it hard to get past this idea of like, well, technically I could still do all of the projects I wanted to do, but the public, maybe many fewer people will read it or see them, or they don't need me. Like how challenging is that for you to think about?
I think like 2 sources of motivation for me that are, maybe slightly impure, but I think they're the same for a lot of creative people are, first of all, like the drive to make the next thing better and put what you've learned and the new ideas you have into use. And like this idea that you could make something that is novel and just like really good. That's very motivating. And I think, I mean, for me, what art is in any form, whether it's written, visual, or whatever, is universal things expressed through unique specifics that right now comes from the person who's making it. So like, obviously I have a pretty strong attachment to my own weird little worldview in that way. And I think like, again, impure. I think like I hate the term creators because it's just like, ugh, like marketing copy speak, but it is just sort of like, it's strangely apt because the process of making stuff is, you know, you are the god, the creator of this tiny universe where the rules are what you make them. And, you know, I'm a control freak and I like controlling every detail of my little universes and, you know, at least hanging on to the delusion that maybe someday I can do it better than anyone else could for my tiny universe. So again, these are all like emotional things. I also think that like, do I like writing? I don't know. Like, I can't seem to stop doing it though. Yeah. And I think probably a lot of writers feel that way. And I think if AI was taking over all the professional creative work, probably I might go back to doing more writing or more drawing and less writing, although I can't say for sure. And I also think, I will say, I think there's a lot of elements of writing that are not putting words on a page or, you know, digital page, like the sort of management of story process. And it's interesting to think about like what that might look like in a world where all of the actual writing can be done just as well by AI.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, yeah, I mean, I think it's the case that already, you know, people, you know, are obsessed with doing like the Wordle or like the spelling bee, like puzzles that they do every day, which is like not their jobs. And to me, writing is kind of the best example of that for me, like sort of painting yourself into these boxes and being like, all right, well, I need this thing has to have a good reason for happening. How does this land? How do these things come together? Like, you know, you don't want to have, not to get too like writing advice or something, but you don't want to have a story that's like, this happened, and then another thing happened, and then another thing happened, and then also this thing happened. You know, you need everything to be tied and being like, this happened, therefore this happened, and because this happened, this happens, and it all has to be interconnected. And I find it to be a very compelling puzzle where I would rather do that than do, you know, the Wordle or something. And so I do wonder if it's, maybe, you know, it does feel much more like a hobby if you take it off the table that you're actually gonna make things. But that maybe it's, I don't know, kind of like, well, actually with me, where again, if AI like replaced my job and I had infinite time, you know, was comfortable, didn't need money or anything, you know, I would love to learn the piano. I can't play the piano. I would love to. Like, that would just be fun for me. I don't expect to be the best piano player in the world, but it'll be fun. So yeah, I don't know. I think there is a more positive framing potentially where it's like, yeah, okay, AIs are the best at everything. However, boy, it would be nice to, you know, write these stories, solve these puzzles, play instruments that you never would have otherwise had a chance to because you were working as like the junior vice president at Pepsi, and you know that was your entire life, and now you get to do things that are more fun. Yeah.
In this world, I retreat to my 16-year-old profession as a swim instructor. Teach kids to swim.
Cool. All right. Well, let's get into Ada then specifically. So this is what you've been working on lately. This is what the last couple of years of your life, I guess. First of all, what is Ada?
Yeah, so Ada is an animated series where every episode is exploring what the future could be like with a different transformative technology or policy. And the main character is named Ada. She's an assistant in a public library, recent grad, lots of ideas, nobody wants to hear them, grumpy boss, you know, a scenario that many of us may be familiar with. So every episode starts and ends in her home world, in the library where she works. And then the middle is a journey through an imagined future, where she's exploring what it would be like to live as a person in a world where the technology or policy that's the subject of the episode exists. So there are two visual styles to every episode. There's her home world, and then there's the imagined world. And the imagined world, we actually changed up from episode to episode, so it's different. We change up the whole look for the topic, which was super fun.
Yeah, so how did you settle on this specific approach that you took with Ada? Obviously, it sounds like, you could have gone in a lot of different directions. So like, how did we end up with Ada?
Yeah, so I had some evidence that taking a more narrative, character-driven approach to something that could otherwise come across as very explanatory or educational or dry was a good way of getting people to engage with it. The series I worked on for TED-Ed called The Demon of Reason, the premise of that is basically a demon in every episode explains a different logical fallacy by sort of channel surfing through his computer and teleporting into different moments in human history and correcting the errors of our ways. But like prior to that, I'd been trying to find a way to make media literacy compelling because I think it is really compelling, but it can, and it's super important, obviously, for understanding, the news and the things people are saying to you in your life and all sorts of things. But I had not been having good results until I hit on the demon of reason idea. And some of my previous attempts had been fun, like trying to gamify it, doing sort of fun meta jokes about clickbait and stuff, but they still fell pretty flat. Like we're not getting a lot of views. People were not sticking with them. So the difference between that stuff and how people engage with the demon of reason was really stark. I think it was like 2 or 3 times the views. So that experience really made me think that there was something to a more narrative, more character-driven approach to educational stuff that I wanted to push even further in the direction of narrative and using a compelling protagonist who's also kind of a host. Like they're the main character, but they're also kind of a YouTuber, for lack of a better word. They're telling you about the things they're doing. So that was like the genesis of doing that for Ada.
How explicitly effective altruism-y did you want Ada to be when you got started? I don't have a good sense of whether it was okay, I am doing this thing that's very tied to effective altruism, or is it no, I'm making something that's closer to TED-Ed work, and then I'm gonna introduce some EA things. What was the vision?
Yeah, so no, it was not meant to be explicitly about effective altruism, but it also wasn't meant to be, it was also meant to be a departure from other things I'd done in the past. I think my goal was getting people to engage with weird stuff and in a real way, not in a, sort of superficial or trivial way. So if it had one goal, it was that. And there's a lot of overlap between that and I think things that are important in EA, but that was not really the goal. It was not meant to be an introduction to EA or convert people to EA.
Yeah. And did that goal that you started off with, did that change during the writing and production process? Or did you set this as a goal and then it just was pretty consistent?
I think it was pretty consistent, but the approach to doing that definitely evolves from one episode to the next. That was always sort of a guiding star, was modeling this. And I think in particular, modeling sort of an exuberant spirit of inquiry. And, Ada's voice is very conversational and chatty. Actually, the vibe we were trying to get was friends debating existential questions in a bar rather than something more serious. And also, the premise is, should we make these technologies a reality? But the goal was never to deliver a definitive yes or no verdict on that. It's to make the case that we should develop the policies and ethics and social structures to support them in parallel and in proportion to our investment in the technologies themselves. So it's not trying to deliver a verdict.
Yeah. Tell us how you thought about setting a target audience for Ada.
Yeah. So I define the target audience as any curious person, but especially people in their teens or early 20s with lots of passion, little power, and existential concerns about the world they inherit, like Ada. But I guess I ultimately, when I'm starting with an idea and sort of arriving at the treatment for it, I don't actually think it's helpful to think super specifically about a target audience. I think for me, I am always trying to find the closest thing to a universal truth, or I guess trying to set an ambitious goal of if I were to do this as well as it could possibly be done, anyone would be able to relate to it, right? Obviously that's a very ambitious goal that we're never going to meet, but I do think that should be the starting point goal of anything. That's how you find what's important and meaningful and will make people feel that the subject matter is important or will make them feel connected to it.
So to begin with, yeah, you don't want to be worrying too much about this specific target audience, but does that change by the time you have a final script?
Yes and no. So I think there are some practical concerns, right? Like, if you are trying to sell it to mainstream distributors, there are certain conventions that you're really going to have a hard time doing that if you break. So for example, if you're writing a novel that you intend to be for tweens, then the protagonist can't be 40, right? They can't be 16. They have to be 12 or 13 or under. So in that sense, yes. But I guess when you look at the ways people consume content, kids love stuff that's intended for adults, or ostensibly intended for adults all the time. Adults love stuff that's intended for kids all the time. So I really do think that these ideas of target audience that we have, or that are sort of setting the mandate at, broadcasters or commissioners or whatever, don't super correspond to how people actually enjoy stories. And so I am fairly resistant to that. And I also think especially for less experienced people, you can kind of fall into a trap of defining too narrow a target audience, which I think I've noticed this a lot with this idea of who is your ideal viewer? Imagine them in your head while you make the thing. I think that that's an easy way to unintentionally justify creative choices that aren't working. I think you can kind of like talk yourself into things that don't really work. And I also think that it's just really hard to make something while thinking about the audience. I think it just kind of doesn't work. It like breaks the magic. And it's hard. You want to keep clarity of vision and keep steering the ship, and you don't want things to get muddled. And I think thinking too much about the audience while you're making something can do that. You have to sort of stay connected to like what you've identified as like the most essential grain of truth in the thing, and focus on drawing that out. So I think thinking too much about the target audience makes you think both too much and too little about pleasing people, and the results are bad.
Yeah. No, I think that's reasonable. But I do think that we've mostly been like agreeing on everything up to this point. So I do want to push back on this like target audience not having this use, because that was my one dominating concern as I was watching all of the episodes of Ada. I just kept asking myself, I didn't know what the answer was, who the target audience was, which makes a lot more sense now. But I'll sort of like outline why this like would concern me, with like two extremes. One would be like you went in to the final script of Ada and you were like, look, I intend this to be for people who have like, I don't know, they have a bachelor's degree at least in some kind of like scientific discipline, something like that, right? Fairly like high level of knowledge going in. And in that case, it would mean that audience would be kind of bored if you like held their hands too much. So you would have to be comfortable with a bit of jargon and moving like at quite a fast pace. But on the other end, you could aim for people who have either they're in high school or they just like went to a different, profession, or really have like no scientific background, in which case you really have to define basically everything for them to be able to follow the story. And so, yeah, I noticed within Ada, there were times when it felt like it was flipping between these sort of audience, where it was like, there was a tone where I'm like, oh, this is for younger people. This is like, yeah, Ada's 22, maybe it's for people who are a bit younger than her, introducing that topic. But then something would happen, like there's an episode with gene drives. I mean, you only have 10 minutes, but it was like a one-sentence explanation of gene drives and like casually mentioned CRISPR. And I couldn't help but thinking like, there is no way teenagers, people in their early 20s without experience will be able to know what this is. They don't know what CRISPR is. So I just kept on getting caught between being like, okay, if we knew we were aiming for people like under 20 who like without much of a background, I would be like wanting to go through the script and like putting like a big red line under like every piece of jargon and term and trying to define it. Mm-hmm. On the other end, if you were like, no, this is for people who understand all that stuff, well, then you can move faster. But yeah, I felt like it just, without having a clear target audience, you can get into this sort of uncanny valley thing where it's like both the tone is for one group, but then that group might not be able to follow the concepts. And if you lose them on the concepts, then they don't get to like follow the narrative arc. And yeah, this is basically like was my big concern here, and why I think at least partially thinking about target audience could be very helpful.
Yeah, well,
that's my little speech.
Definitely the gene drives episode was, you are correct, the most difficult one to balance this stuff in. And I think part of that is, I think would come up with any target audience if you're trying to focus on the ethics of emerging technologies or technologies that don't exist yet, because it's like, okay, we're not focusing on the technical, the how does this work side. We're not focusing on that. We're focusing on the implications. But there is some amount of the how does it work that you have to explain. And that is, I'm not sure I've found the right answer to that, but I do think that that is always gonna be a tension and a problem, like even if you do have a super well-defined target audience. That being said, definitely the Gene Drives one was the hardest to strip back the jargon. On the one hand, it's better to like basically trust people to be smart and figure things out, but that's a little reductive, obviously. Like if people are completely unfamiliar with topics, it doesn't always work. But that being said, I have consistently been surprised by how young of kids are interested in and tracking the story of things that I've worked on without, like, certainly have not encountered all the concepts in it before. So yeah, definitely there's tension there. I am not sure I've found the right answer. I think that some of it is inherent to the subject. And I also think that some of that might be due to the format of Ada. Because like we're used to educational stuff being either like completely dry nonfiction or being for kids. And I do kind of think that, like, why? That doesn't really make sense to me. Like, I don't know. Adults like to learn things and have fun at the same time too. So why not try that? So there are certain senses in which it's an experiment in format and in subject. So I think some of the tensions you point out are definitely there. I am not sure that I would attach them to not having a focused enough target audience.
Yeah, I mean, that is the thing that I'm more concerned about is in the direction of, leaving younger people behind who would otherwise be really into it. That was what I was worried about, just being like, it would be like a shame if they sort of bounce for it a bit. And I will say it's actually, it's somewhat of a similar problem with, I produce and run the 80,000 Hours podcast. And I think a lot about target audience for our episodes. And we should have different target audiences for each episode. And so I sort of like hammer this home to the team working on it. Because you get these like really practical things where it's like, okay, you're making an episode that is specifically for people who might be able to go and work on this like top level machine learning job tomorrow. It's like, all right, well, you just have to kind of accept that most people won't be able to follow this. It's just like really technical. But in the other direction, if you're like, well, no, I want this to be for everyone who would listen to this, well, then I am much more likely to be like, I don't really care if people who know a lot about this are going to have to sit through some definitions. That's the more important thing. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it did make me think that there's like this specific device you use in Ada, which I like love in a lot of contexts, of having her inner monologue. She's imagining these worlds. Mm-hmm. And it struck me that there was this inherent, I don't know, challenge you've set for yourself here, because if you're playing at what improvisers would say at the top of your intelligence, so like really playing out a scene as if it was really happening, basically. So it doesn't feel like a TV show. It feels like a real conversation. Well, Ada's imagination would never need to explain anything. She knows what CRISPR is, and so it wouldn't actually make sense for her to stop and define CRISPR if she's imagining it, because she's talking to herself. So like you almost like, yeah, it would feel jarring if she then like slowed down for anyone who didn't who knew less than her. Yeah. Whereas like if it was like set up in a slightly different way, where it was like, I don't know, Ada had a young assistant or a cousin or something who was like staying with her and was in the library with her, and like everything she's imagining she has to explain to someone who's this like 15-year-old cousin or something, and then it would give you this excuse basically to like define terms in a way that would make sense.
Yeah, and I think part of this is like trying to navigate this territory of making things more narrative while we can still learn from them, is like what feels contrived. Yeah. We definitely at some moments in Ada get around this a little bit by like she is learning about a subject and we're hearing her inner monologue as she researches or reads or learns about something. So we're not getting like a transcript of what she's reading. We're getting her response to it and her, oh, what's this? I have this follow-up question. Oh, okay, now I have this follow-up question. But yeah, it's definitely a little bit tricky.
Yeah, totally. Okay, cool. So I thought it would be fun to bounce a very different idea off you, get your take.
Okay.
So, you'll have to excuse my monologue a little bit to set this up.
Cool.
I recorded an 80,000 Hours podcast episode with AJ Jacobs a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And in that episode, I said to him that I thought the best approach to making a high-impact TV show, by our lights, was probably something like, you make something like a Mad Men, same level of writing, directing, acting, everything. But just instead of it being set in Madison Avenue in the 50s through 70s, it's like an open philanthropy like org. So, a premier grant making organization, maybe in a world where effective altruism didn't exist. Or like another idea would be you make something like Breaking Bad, but instead of Walter White making this money for his family, he's planning to donate all of this money to effective charities. Although I realize that all the listeners will think that now sounds like a much worse idea in the wake of the FTX implosion. But anyway, stay with me. So during COVID, like many people, I had a bit of extra time, and I wrote a pilot and a 10-episode series outline for a show that I call Bequest. And I ended up trying to combine elements of both of these ideas in that the characters, about halfway through the show, starred an open phil like org, and also it's like pretty dark and violent. And I'll put up links for my script and the series outline in the show notes for anyone that is listening who would rather check out Bequest before listening to this section. But basically, my overall thinking was that you try to make a show that's popular independent of the message. And then if folks are like super engaged, they'll kind of helplessly learn about a lot of EA stuff. You almost can't help but be able to pass a simple quiz on Madison Avenue in the 60s if you're a Mad Men fan, or actually apparently Breaking Bad generated a surge of interest in chemistry among students, and apparently even some people started to become science bloggers, and obviously that wasn't their intention. But in big red letters in my mind, I thought it would be good to try and avoid as much as you can coming across as being preachy or like overtly educational, I guess, because I felt like you'd lose a lot of people. So yeah, I'm just very curious. What do you think of that broad approach?
I think being preachy and being overtly educational are not really, I wouldn't say they're the same thing. I think
I meant those being different things, actually. I meant okay. One thing is like to avoid being preachy, and then like there's another thing of not making it over, but I do separate that. So I wanted to be clear that like I think of like Ada as being educational but not preachy, in that like if you were being preachy, I think
moralizing, right?
Yeah, so it's like, the kidney donation episode would have ended with you being like, and if you don't donate your kidney, you're an ethical monster, but you actually took pains to not be like that. Yeah.
So I think overtly educational is fine as long as you're not making it seem like you're trying not to be educational, right? You have to be open about it. And actually, I think there's more examples of this in literature and fiction than in TV and films, in part because the exposition of making things educational is a little bit easier to work in. But like, I think a really good example of something that's narrative but overtly educational and intended for an adult audience is The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson is a great example of something that is overtly educational, but also, the point of it is fiction, right? So yeah, I think I agree with you. Definitely don't be preachy. I don't think I agree, don't be educational.
So yeah, I guess it's like, so if you've got this sort of portfolio of approaches to storytelling, to fiction, trying to have an impact, I guess I was curious in your take on having like both these things exist, right? So it's like you have things like Ada, and then you have things more in this realm that I'm talking about.
So I don't think I really see impact downsides between these two approaches. I think either, could be effective, and I don't really think that it's obvious which would be more effective, just based on like that amount of information, right? Assuming that these things are really well made and they're sort of adequately supported in terms of promotion and stuff. I think like for me, the sort of big risks for impact-oriented media projects, like the big failure modes, are not getting made and not getting released. So, the not getting made thing can happen at lots of phases, right? It can happen, the script isn't made into a pilot, the pilot isn't made into a series, the series is canceled quickly if we're talking about TV shows.
Yep.
But it can also, and this is an experience that it's never happened to me, fortunately, so far, but a lot of my team who worked on Ada, I think almost all of them had this experience at some time or other, is you make the movie or the show, it's completely finished, and then it doesn't get released because, the network or whoever owns the IP, whoever's funding it, decides for whatever reason not to do that. So I think that like the risks of those things happening increase with sort of bigger budget, prestige, drama type things, because, the kind of money it takes to make these things means you're going to be almost certainly as the creator and the person whose incentive is impact as opposed to as opposed to making money, right? You're almost certainly going to be relinquishing control over the IP completely. So you don't really have control, like many sort of perverse forces can prevent your thing from getting out into the world, even if it's great. So I think that is like the main drawback I see.
Yeah, no, that all makes total sense to me. I was curious, you described Ada as the magic school bus, but grown up. When you started your Should We studio, did you also have this part of the approach in mind? Like, was it always going to be, the magic school bus, but grown up?
I don't really remember when I came up with that as a comp title. I think it was pretty early on. It was definitely in pre-production. And I think it's worth, noting that Ada's an experiment. We'll see. We'll see how it lands with people. But I kind of had an intuition partially based on the success of previous projects that were sort of trying to bridge the narrative, character-driven, and educational gap, that there was room for more of this kind of stuff. And, that people who have aged out of the magic school bus demographic still like educational stuff. And, why not try it, right? I sort of have some indicators, but don't know how it's going to land with people yet. But it seems really worth pursuing to me and well suited to the subject matter of Ada.
Yeah, no, totally. And as much as your Ada will get compared to things, do you think it makes more sense to compare it to the category of TV show or to educational explainers on YouTube?
I mean, in terms of production value, it's definitely a TV show.
Yeah.
But I think there's like increasing blurring of the lines between these things. And in general, it's very exciting to see how sort of new formats are emerging and formats are being combined. I think another like good comparison point for Ada is The Midnight Gospel, which is similarly, it's an animated show. It has a home world, imagined world sort of set up in the same way that Ada does. And then the imagined world journeys are their actual like podcast audio, which is funny. And they're just like very psychedelic wanderings that go along with them. But yeah, I think that is like maybe the closest format I've seen to what Ada is, although substantively they're very different. And again, with Ada, the explanation element, it's not super fact-based. It's like the facts that we need to embark on these ethical questions. But I think a lot of explainer video type things are more breaking the facts of events or scientific concepts or whatever it may be down.
Yeah, with Bequest, I was trying to make it like very dark and adult, and with the idea being that, you're trying to reach as many people as you can, but like only expecting only 1, 2, 3, 4% of people would actually, pick up on these important ideas. But it feels like with Ada, you're aiming for a higher percentage of people to come away really thinking about stuff differently, and then, maybe taking a hit on the total audience. Does that sound about right?
I wouldn't say that. I don't think thinking of it in those terms or like that as a particular trade-off was on my mind. I think I was going into it very aware of, I want to make sure the thing can be good, and equally as importantly, that it can get into the world, and less so about relative percentages of different types of storytelling of who might take a message away, I guess. But I do think overtly educational stuff can reach huge audiences. Like the Magic School Bus is a prime example of that, right? It's like one of the most beloved sort of TV shows ever, which is not at all to say that that's going to happen to Ada. So yeah, I would say I was not thinking of it in those terms.
Yeah, so you talked a bit about, you were like very conscious of making sure that you were giving yourself the best chance of getting something made. I suppose there's like two ways you can think about this. One would be like, I want to maximize my chances of getting it made, and then from that point, I get to have some impact. Or you could have the like broader thing where you're like, look, I want to maximize the expected value of this show, where it's like, okay, I'm going to like swing for the fences, and that's going to include a big chance that it'll never get made. But that if it does get made, it'll have this big impact. Yeah, did you think about that at all in terms of like, the, higher risk versus lower risk approaches to having an impact?
So I think I would have approached it differently. Well, okay. So to me, the scarier thing is it gets made and nobody ever sees it, because that's so much more of an investment of time and effort than it doesn't get made. When I started Should We Studio, and I was sort of talking to advisors about how to approach pitching Ada to distributors, a few of them were like, well, why don't you just keep pitching shows until something sticks and just spend all the money doing that? Like, that's what I would do. And others were like, are you kidding? This is a super rare opportunity to have the financing to actually make the whole thing yourself and retain creative control in that way. Just do it and then figure out the distribution later. And I ended up going with the latter. But I'm not sure there is a right or wrong answer there. I guess the thing I will say about the swing for the fences approach is that what ends up getting made through those kind of pathways, it's not necessarily a meritocracy, right? It's not like you maximize your chances of it getting picked up by making it as good as possible. I think even taking out aiming for impact in the entertainment industry, there is a very weird dynamic where creative people want to make art, but the decision makers are trying to make money, right? So there's already like this big friction going on. That's even before you get into trying to generate impact. So I guess I would say that's like a reservation about the swing for the fences approach. I think it's, and obviously nothing is a perfect or maybe even close to perfect meritocracy, but I think it's even less so than some other things.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Do you have a take on whether it's okay to have, anti-heroes or even genuinely evil characters in a story that's supposed to be about doing good?
Yes, okay, and encouraged. No, it's seriously though, I don't think anything is out of bounds. And actually, I think that morally gray characters or even outright evil characters are very important for kind of getting into our mindsets and sort of our public consciousness, like the murkiness of situations and the fact that nothing is ever all good or bad, and like the kind of stories that have been told in TV and movies and other mediums as well, increasingly over the past 20 years or so, actually do kind of affect the way that people think, or at least have affected the way I think about interpreting situations and people's actions and the sort of intertangled threads of, you can't see air quotes, but I'm doing them, good and evil. So I actually think it's super valuable to have that stuff in things that are trying to do good.
Yeah, agree. Cool. So let's turn to animation. So why does Should We Studio focus on animation in particular?
Well, first of all, we're making stuff about the future and worlds that don't exist yet. And animation is a medium that lets you invent a world completely from scratch, like every single thing in it, which I find super exciting and I think lends itself really well to work about the future or alternative futures or imagination. My personal attachment to animation, like my whole career so far pretty much has been in animation. And the reason for that is that I came to it through a fine art background, so drawing and painting, as opposed to through a film background. So like the artistry was always, the thing that got me most excited. And I think with still drawings and paintings, I eventually sort of realized that the thing that was most compelling to me about visual art was the opportunity to tell a story, and the amount of story you can tell in a single painting is kind of limited. I mean, the art historians are gonna come for me, but I think it's true. So that was kind of how I found my way to animation. And I think just the sort of variety and diversity of looks and techniques within animation are super exciting. And I'm just also really drawn to sort of wacky stuff, like to like weirdness and joy and cheekiness. And I think it lends itself really well to that as a medium.
Yeah, totally agree.
There are also like reasons it's good for educational stuff specifically. Like I think if you're trying to be explanatory, it's easy to add a layer of information density without it feeling more dense to the viewer. I also think that like at its best, educational animated stuff is not doing what we call show and say, which is the visuals exactly repeat what's in the words. They're sort of, you're using visual humor and visual metaphors to sort of complement the words. And I've always been drawn to like visual puns. Like, okay, I'm outing myself as a giant nerd here, but like the ancient Egyptians used to do like hieroglyphic puns, like using like the shapes of the hieroglyphs to like make little jokes. And same with illuminated manuscripts. There's like all this sort of subtext annotated into them that's just hilarious. It's like a whole nother story. So that kind of humor is very exciting to me.
Have you come across any major drawbacks to animation as a medium, especially if your ultimate goal is impact?
It's slow. So it is not, I don't think it's the best medium for breaking news. So I see that as like the biggest drawback. It's hard to react quickly to things. It's also expensive, but it's interesting because it's expensive for a super low budget indie. But if you're trying to make like really beautiful sci-fi, fantasy, second world stuff, it is much cheaper or much more feasible on an indie budget than it would be to do that live action and have like all those visual effects. So that is like both a pro and a con. And also like prejudice. Like I think definitely some people still see animation as for kids, even though that has never been the case. And I think even some sort of like distributors and commissioners, an animated project has to fit into the bucket of for kids or like the sort of raunchy shock humor, like adult cartoons type of thing. It has to be kind of one or the other. But really, animation's a medium. It's not a genre. It can be applied to any genre equally effectively. Yeah. So that's a frustration. I don't think it's a drawback of animation, but it is a drawback of trying to sell animation. So maybe to trying to create impact through animation.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Okay, so I wanted to get your thoughts on this, and I did send it to you before recording. So I came up with an idea for a long-termist Christmas movie, and I'll share it here just in case it's fun. But basically, it's where Christmas is a foreign aid program of the North Pole government. So it's like charity for the rest of the world. But Santa is a long-termist, and he's mostly motivated by making sure that kids in the future, thousands, millions, even billions of years in the future, they'll all get to enjoy wonderful Christmases. And so our story revolves around 4 kids who all need to save future Christmases. The hope is that once these characters and the audience, they care about future kids getting presents, well, hopefully then they'll have to admit that they care about, future lives generally. And so I had this Christmas variation of Will McCaskill's basic case for long-termism, which he gave on our show a couple of years ago. But it goes like this. There's four points to it. So 1, kids who exist in the future deserve some degree of moral consideration. All right, that seems pretty straightforward. 2, the future could be very big or very long. That's actually just exactly Will's point. 3, we can reasonably hope to influence whether kids in the future get Christmas presents and how good or bad their presents are. And 4, so trying to make sure Christmas exists for future generations is a key priority of the holiday season. That is my 4-step case for Christmas long-termism. And part of my thinking with this was that like the most successful Christmas movies get replayed every year. And so even though it's this big long shot, we're talking about High Risk Not for Poor, if you could just create like just one of the 10 Christmas movies that gets replayed over and over again, and it happened to have these long-termist themes, and then kids just grew up with this being more normalized or less weird, that felt to me like it would be kind of a big deal. And actually, I have no idea what you thought about this. So yeah, what was your reaction to this idea?
I mean, big picture, I think it's diabolical, and I love a Trojan horse. And now I'm someone needs to apply this to writing a series of horny romance novels or something, and that would be awesome and hilarious. Yeah, so I like the direction you're going with that. This is going to be annoying, but for the actual idea you propose, I think there's a slight mismatch between content and target audience. Because here we go. I might be misremembering parts of it, but there was an election and a voting situation and that kind of conflict. And so that plus the foreign aid program idea feels older than the child protagonist saving Christmas idea. And I don't know how to reconcile it. I think it's possible for sure. But yeah. I would be curious.
Yeah, no, I love it that you're admitting everything I say about target audiences. That is satisfying. That's the only reason I wrote this, was to prove a point.
Yeah.
I think it's very fair and definitely a challenge. And I haven't actually written the script for this, just an outline. But yeah, I do think, in defense of this idea, I do think if you run down the most popular Christmas movies, they do appeal to both kids and adults. I mean, if you take something like Home Alone, which by the way, I still watch Home Alone every year with my wife.
So now you're defending my idea about target audience.
Yeah, in that, I don't know if it's that I think that people give Christmas movies more of a break or something. I don't know what's going on, but it's a good point that you raise. In that I do think, yeah, there's something about the Christmas, it's going to sound very comically holiday. There is something about the Christmas season where I think people are more up for I don't know, like giving stories I don't know, a bit more leeway to be to be like more kids, I think.
Yeah, they're full and bored and the weather's bad.
I kind of do think that there are like different rules a bit for like, hey, it is December 23rd and the tree's up and we're, eating these sugar cookies. And yeah, there's something about that where it's like, you're not really looking to watch Mad Men on December 23rd. It's like start that with the family, Yeah, I mean, I would do that.
Yeah. Also, though, I think you're definitely onto something because, the sort of simpler version of what you're describing is A Christmas Carol, which is like maybe the best known Christmas story ever.
Yeah. Any other takes on, even if this specific one wouldn't have landed, like the idea of, I don't know, should we studio making an animated Christmas movie one day?
No, I don't want to make a Christmas movie, but I think it's a great idea and someone should do it.
Totally makes sense. So one thing I think that's like pretty uncontroversial is that films and TV shows can inform people about a topic that they don't know much about going in. There's other way that stories can have a real impact for me, which was humanizing people in groups. I think this could be very good, very effective there. And so one, I think, great example is the movie Philadelphia from the 90s, which is where Tom Hanks won the Best Actor award at the Oscars for playing a gay man who gets fired from his job for having AIDS. And that apparently seems to have like a real effect of people being like, oh, both these people are just people, and also I don't have to be like terrified of this of this disease I don't know anything about.
Yeah.
Does that align with your view that really can have this very powerful role in reducing prejudice, humanizing groups?
Oh, definitely. And Dallas Buyers Club comes to mind as like a 2010s update on that, which is, sort of more nuance specifically to, humanizing different people who might have AIDS. But yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, it got me thinking, is there something that we, sort of the universal we, doesn't have to be us, but maybe us, could do in a kind of effective altruism-ish category? It feels like digital minds are really one group, which maybe Westworld has like covered partially, but trying to, anticipate this problem of like, oh, it is like plausible we will build digital minds that are at least plausibly conscious, and there will be trillions of them, and they will have rich lives, and also it'll be very possible to torture them. This seems like a very scary thing, but right now I think almost no one would care about them as a group. So it's possible. That's one. And then I was also wondering if there's like some masterpiece waiting to be made about future generations, where it's like, can you get people to care about future generations? So like I've played around with this idea where it's like, okay, you have like two timelines. One is like a base reality where people are trying to like reduce X risk in some way. Maybe they're trying to prevent a pandemic. And then you're simultaneously playing this other timeline where you have, just like a family, and it's just like a story that might just exist on its own, that you just really care about these people. And you have this link where it's like, well, if like person A doesn't like stop the world from ending in this timeline, the family in like timeline B like won't get to exist, and now you really care about them. And hey, it turns out that even though they're 200 years in the future, they're still people. Yeah, I don't know that exists yet, but it feels like both very hard, but also a bit tantalizing, where it's this, what seems to a lot of people in the effective altruism community as being like fairly straightforward of like, yeah, you should care about people even if they're born 500 years in the future. It does feel like that's not something that has landed widely yet. Yeah. Any reaction to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things about both of those subjects you mentioned that is tricky in a narrative film format, and especially like a mass market, formulaic, I don't mean that in a bad way, but like hero's journey type storyline is the numbers element of it. Like I think for both digital minds and future generations, like the sheer number of people that could exist is part of what makes those compelling. And that is hard to figure out for like a character driven story in the scope of a film. Maybe it's better for a really big novel. Yeah, I also have I'm not gonna say half-baked, maybe like 1/16 baked idea along those lines, which is, this question of, would you want to live through all the suffering that's ever happened and all the good stuff that's ever happened, or not exist? To me, that feels like it could be a really fun, speculative fiction film. I mean, maybe fun's the wrong word, but yeah.
No, I'm with you. So I think, again, that's like a pretty uncontroversial category. I think people will be on board with this. But I want to challenge storytelling a bit more by looking at some harder cases. And so I'm wondering if we think that TV shows and films are capable of changing really strongly held opinions where the viewer had the exact opposite view going in. So yeah, starting with you personally, can you think of an example where a TV show or movie actually changed your mind about something very specific? So like an example would be like, I like passionately thought that nuclear power was dangerous and like I campaigned against it or something. And then I watched this movie and it totally changed my mind. You know, do you have anything that like that lands in that category?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I was trying to think about this too. And I was like, I don't know that I have a good example too. Like, but if you had have asked me a week ago, just like, is that possible? I would have been like, yeah, well, sure.
Yeah. So I think the reason neither of us is coming up with an example of a film that's changed, caused a complete flip on a deeply entrenched position for us is that is something that's really hard to do, period, in like any form of media or conversation or persuasive technique. I think the situations in which it's possible to change people's minds when they're really convinced they're right about something is if people are operating from the same starting set of facts or beliefs. And I think in some of the examples you name are the ones we're trying to think of, that's very much not the case. But I think that does link back to what I think is sort of the most powerful purpose of films and TV and other stories for creating impact is to basically bring things into people's awareness that weren't there before and sort of start updating our set of values or beliefs or ways of thinking about certain things.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, this is what sort of inspired me to think this was plausible at all. It's just this idea that, you take effective altruism. Most people in the world who would be really sympathetic to effective altruism have never heard of it. They've never heard the concept. They've never heard these questions. There was a pilot that was done a few years ago where, or a study a few years ago where it was like, even people like top US colleges mostly have like never heard of these ideas, even though they really want to do good in the world. And so for me, it seemed like, yeah, a very clear way of impact is just getting these like core ideas in front of people who might be like naturally inclined to them, who otherwise will never see it. So like to use my own example, I was a professional poker player before I heard of EA. And when I heard of EA, I was just immediately on board with it. It took like literally 2 minutes, where it was just like, oh, that's just for me, right? It's like, it's almost like you could describe EA to a poker player as being like, yeah, it's just like a poker player's approach to charity, because it's just the same thing in terms of thinking about everything in terms of expected value. So if there was like a good EA-ish movie in like 2005 or something, I would have just been an EA in like 2005. But like, I didn't hear about it until like 2016. And so yeah, it just feels like there is this room where you don't necessarily have to be, I don't know, even trying to like have these like big impossible like mind-changing things, which, as you say, like you can spend 100 hours with someone and not even move the needle on changing their mind on like a deeply entrenched issue. But just if it's like, I have never heard of the idea that you can compare causes and interventions or like that's like a reasonable thing to do, and now I've heard of it and now it makes sense to me. Yeah. Any reaction to all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what excites me about making things for general audiences is the sheer size of the possible audience, as opposed to doing things that are sort of more niche or intended not to reach a lot of people. So yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's a lot of the exciting possibility. I think it's kind of sad because the feedback, like whether you've done that or not, is pretty hard to get. But yeah. Yeah, it would have this massive lag where it's like eventually like 9 years later, someone changed their career and then maybe they do a podcast on it and they're like tracing back. Like, the people who made that short film you're talking about, right? Like they, presumably, unless you've met them, have no idea that they like had this huge impact on your life. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But maybe they would now, 9 years later, maybe they would hear this and be like, oh, wow, I had like a big positive impact in the world because they have this like counterfactual responsibility for everything Elizabeth does.
Yeah, and I think that is sort of the weird thing about pursuing storytelling to, grandiose as it sounds, make the world a better place. Because I think everyone can point to, books and movies and whatever that like really were really formative for you. But none of the people who made those things probably, unless you, wrote them a letter when you're a super passionate young person or whatever. Like, they probably don't know. So it's just sort of this very weird thing where we have this intuition that it matters, but the actual evidence of it is kind of thin on the ground.
Okay, so let's now turn to other ways of storytelling besides TV and movies. I know you're keen to talk about this. Yeah, any take on, as opposed to TV and movies, how promising novels or short stories are as a path to impact?
So I think novels and short stories are extremely promising as a path to impact. In terms of like directly comparing them to TV and movies, I mean, one obvious thing is they're much cheaper experiments. Obviously, it's, a reduction to say that one person writes a book, but pretty much one person writes a book and it's cheap. It's just the cost of one person's time compared to like the operational lift of a film or TV series. But I do think that in order to sort of fully enter, the canon over the long term, to be canonized or to become sort of cultural memes or stories that get repeated and adapted over and over again, books usually do have to become movies or TV shows. So that's sort of how I see those things interacting.
Yeah, totally. Just from a writer's perspective, we were earlier talking about this balance between, wanting to make something that'll actually get made and, maybe doing the highest impact thing. But there's something very appealing to just writing a book and then it already existing. It's like you finish your book and now, maybe it's not published, maybe it's not in a store yet, but you can send that text to people and be like, hey, that's my book.
Yeah. Also, like, this is very much a known strategy. Like, lots of people, write novels for this reason. But one thing I will say is that although traditional publishing, again, not known as a meritocracy, there is a path for making cold submissions that actually leads to people getting represented and their books being published, which you can't say about TV and film. There's no sort of like cold submissions process for that. So it is a little bit more accessible without like the secret Rolodex and etiquette and all that stuff.
Yeah, that seems right. Do you know if that's available to people internationally? Like if you are in India and you write a brilliant novel and you want to reach out to American publishing houses, like is that a thing, or is it like, no, you have to be American?
No, you don't have to be American. I definitely think, India is an interesting example because a lot of people will be writing in English, which is a big barrier. So I think, yeah.
Yes, of course.
Definitely like a lot of US, UK, mostly US and UK, but Canadian, Israeli, whatever agents will represent people from anywhere. Which is not to say they actually in practice do, but...
Yeah, right. Yeah, separate question. Yeah. They're not immediately turned away. Mm-hmm. What's your top example of a novel or a short story that changed your mind about something important?
Yeah. So I think my personal examples are a little bit weird and meta because the ones that like most stick out, the thing they taught me about was storytelling or writing. So, but for me, like the one that sticks out most of all is Moby Dick. I had to read it in high school, and a lot of people were very upset about this. But from like page one, I was like, this book is speaking directly to me. This book was written for me. And, that experience, I can't really think of anything else that compares to it. But I think what I took away from that was a lot like, mostly sort of a roadmap for how to be a writer and the kind of sort of wacky, inquisitive, tangential. There's a line in it that's like, we're going to explore the whole universe, not excluding the suburbs. And that is like very much, in a sentence, what sort of got me about it. It also convinced me that as an adult, I should live by the sea if I wanted to be happy. And that transpired. I have actioned that, which is kind of goofy. But anyway, I also have kind of a bad example of like a book really influencing me in a way that I think was bad. Around the same age, like 15, 16, I picked up Atlas Shrugged, and the kind of individualism of it really appealed to me at that kind of teenage years. And then
formative stage.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when you're trying to like separate yourself from your parents or people around you and like forge your own path, and you haven't really come to appreciate the importance of the collective yet, shall we say?
Yeah, that'll do it. If you grow up in a liberal household and you get into Ayn Rand, yeah.
or had any sort of exposure to political ideologies in practice. So I definitely got deprogrammed a few years later on that, but that definitely had a powerful and I think negative impact on me when I first read it at a sort of suggestible age. So yeah, there's cautionary tales too.
Yeah, nice. Do you think if you were just going to like sum all of the pieces of fiction stories that have had an impact on you over your life, do books just like easily beat TV shows and movies?
I think I've been interested in books for longer. And I also went through a period of about like 5 or 10 years where I only read nonfiction and did not read fiction or watch TV at all because I just found it too addictive. I just like stories too much. So that's also probably part of it. But I do think that I think some of the things that have sort of most profoundly inspired or impacted me are just like very weird animated short films. I think to me that's a pretty ideal medium. But definitely like books and short stories over the course of my life, there's probably more examples.
Yeah. So as a visual artist too, is it true that like writing a novel just like is personally a lot less appealing to you as an idea versus making animated movies or TV shows?
Not at all. And in fact, the idea of being able to sit in a room by myself, like the collaborative aspect of making a film or a series is really awesome and inspiring, but it's also, fairly draining over the course of a production to sort of, be balancing and working with a lot of other people. So, and I'm kind of an introvert, so writing a novel sounds great.
Yeah. So how do you think novels and short stories compare to like creative nonfiction?
I think the things that make them really good and really memorable and have a positive impact are kind of the same things. Like, I think the best creative nonfiction feels in a way like fiction. It's lyrical, it's empathetic, and it's sort of accessing some of those universally relatable things, emotions or experiences or whatever that fiction does. And for me, the example that stands out the most as like maybe potentially more influential than any of the other personal influences I've talked about is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which is a book by Oliver Sacks. He was a physician and neurologist, and it's like case studies in weird neurological phenomena. And like at the age that I encountered this book, I think it was sort of indistinguishable from fiction for me. Like, I don't even think I read it by myself. I think my dad read it aloud to me. But that for me sparked a lifelong interest in neuroscience that, translated into, that's actually what my degree was in college. I obviously did not become a scientist or a doctor, so I don't know, take that impact story with a grain of salt. But yeah, and interestingly, Sacks had like a kind of similar creative nonfiction, well, not similar because, I'm not putting myself in them, but had a creative nonfiction origin story where he read, and this is not recommended, but basically on a giant amphetamine bender, read a 500-page book in one night by like a Victorian doctor that was sort of describing cases he had worked on. And it was just like very evocative and transporting. And that like gave him the inspiration that was like, oh, this is what I should do. Cause he'd been kind of like, struggling with his research and thinking he actually wasn't cut out for research and sort of having a crisis of that kind. And then obviously he became like one of the most notable people ever to do that. So I thought that was kind of a cool impact story, although it does not relate to me personally.
Yeah, no, that's great. Tell us about another one of your favorites.
So I think once again, like environmentalism and climate change, there's some really illustrative examples here in terms of something that did get into the public consciousness. And kind of my like favorite story from there is Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, which basically that she wrote it. It was published, I think, in 1962, but at the time she wrote it, like the USDA and everyone was kind of super hype on pesticides and these are great, they make the crops grow, whatever. And she kind of investigated the harms of pesticides and how they were creating resistant pests that then led to stronger pesticides that then led, this vicious cycle, and how birds and other non-target species and even humans were being harmed by this. And her book just like blew up. But the reason it blew up was because it was so sort of, lyrical and poetic and like, tugging on those heartstrings of how we feel about the natural world. And even the title, like Silent Spring, comes from this idea that all the birds have been killed by pesticides, so there's no bird song, so it has this like cool lyrical thing going on. But that book led pretty directly to the founding of the EPA, which is super cool. And I think like a really clear impact story. Yeah, also cool because at that time, environmentalism was like, I guess, new enough not to have become a partisan thing yet. Like the EPA was founded under the Nixon administration, which is kind of an interesting tidbit. Talking about the murky threads of good and evil.
Yeah, that would have been nice. Could have held up on that.
yeah, no, for sure. And then I think there's one really cool, just to give a recent example of like different approaches to creative nonfiction. 2 books that came out like within a year of each other. So one was The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and one was Trick Mirror. So The Age of Surveillance Capitalism it's a doorstop, right? It's a very long, sort of like dry nonfiction book. And then Trick Mirror is a collection of personal essays. And they're both kind of about the same thing, sort of the commodification of personal data over the last decade or two by big tech companies and sort of the failures to get ahead of that of legislation and regulation. So same idea, 2 totally different approaches. Actually, the doorstop, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, sold really well for like that kind of book. And the term surveillance capitalism kind of became a meme that people understand. But the reach of Trick Mirror, which has like basically the same takeaway, but is told in like a more digestible, accessible way, just like really blew up. Was like everywhere, Obama put it on his list. And just, like tons and tons of people read it. So I thought that was just sort of I think these books came out like 6 months apart. So that's just like a really cool comparison of different techniques to nonfiction for generating impact and awareness of something that had been sort of like sneakily going on, but maybe the threads hadn't sort of coalesced into like, oh, this is happening to people. Like probably a lot of it. I think the reason like both of these books struck such a chord was that probably a lot of elements of them people had felt personally, but hadn't really put it together into the bigger picture. So yeah, that's just another cool nonfiction story.
Yeah, no, that's great. Did you want to talk about any other promising ways of storytelling when your goal is having an impact? So graphic novels, podcasts, Broadway musicals, anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think one that's kind of interesting to me and weird is advice columns. And I started reading a lot of them when I was like in my late teens, early 20s. And I think they just profoundly and positively impacted the way I relate to other people and the way I manage my own emotions. And they're kind of interesting because they're totally anonymized, right? Some of them are made up and some of them are, the plots of famous books that the columnist and their editor don't catch, which is hilarious when that happens, right? So they are like, for all intents and purposes, fiction. And it's just like a silly sort of voyeuristic thing that people like, but something that I think actually has a lot of value in terms of, or can have a lot of value in terms of shaping how people treat each other. So I don't know what can be done with that, but that's one that I've always kind of thought about.
Yeah, very cool. Any others stand out?
Yeah, I guess this is not like a particular format, but I think the key to sort of the most impactful or the most lasting stories is that they get adapted into many different formats. And, we were talking about A Christmas Carol earlier, and I don't think a lot of people realize that like originates with Dickens, right? And they're like, they've got like
right.
The Muppet Christmas Carol or whichever, pick your film adaptation. But there are sort of like so many things that become cultural shorthand or become known stories. And just thinking about how things sort of get into the water supply and never die is interesting. Like one phenomenon that's really interesting to me is like Jane Austen adaptations, because the plots of her books are like pretty basic, but the fans are rabid, and that's down to like the prose of the originals. But it makes people interested in having infinite adaptations that do not have that element of the originals, but retain the like kind of basic plot. So that is super interesting to me. And I think there's got to be some clever way of turning that into storytelling for impact.
Yeah, all right. So like getting back to Ada, yeah, how did Ada actually get made? Would you be up for, breaking down step by step how you actually went from the idea to Ada to the final release?
Yeah, the initial pitch for Ada was fairly simple. There was a lot of work to be done, starting with just defining the character, defining the setting, and then from there defining what the sort of tone and visual style would be. So like in pre-production, we had a long phase of like research and references. And kind of the first thing I focused on was who this character of Ada was going to be. And I had this vague idea that she might be based on Ada Lovelace, who is sort of by many people considered to have articulated the first description of artificial intelligence, but was also just sort of a wacky, misunderstood character. As I think Ada in Ada is also a little bit that way, hopefully not meeting such a tragic end. But yeah, so I started looking at other historical figures and how we could pull elements for sort of both the personality and the look of this character. And another inspiration was Chu Jin, who was, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but I'm doing my best, who was a Chinese revolutionary and sort of feminist poet who was, executed by the state quite young for her revolutionary activities. But she has this kind of amazing portrait that's like super formal, seated, formal clothes, formal hair. And then she's just like holding an unsheathed dagger in her lap, which I thought is just like the most amazing portrait ever. So kind of her hairstyle and vibe went into the character of Ada too, as well as that energy of like revolutionary activity with sort of fashionable flair. I thought was really fun. And then kind of the final reference for Ada was Sor Juana, who was a Mexican nun during the Inquisition. And the reason she became a nun was because she was very interested in like math and philosophy and drama, writing poems and plays and stuff. But the only way to pursue that at the time was to become a nun. So she became a nun. Eventually, her stuff became too sort of outrageous and outspoken and progressive. And so the Catholic Church made her stop doing all her stuff, but renew her vows. And like as a protest, she like renewed her vows in her own blood, like signed all the stuff in her own blood. It's like, okay, that's, so I really like that energy. But I think, all three of these people had a lot of kind of character and passion, but also there's like a loneliness and a being misunderstood, and a compromise in their stories, which, Ada in the series does not have anything like as trying circumstances, but bringing a little bit of that feeling, which I think people relate to, into her character too. And then for the setting, I think, so Ada's set in a library. That's the home world she starts in and returns to in every episode. And that setting was not part of the original pitch, but it seemed just like a very natural fit because I was thinking about libraries of history and literature. So the Library of Alexandria, where the goal was to get all the knowledge in the world into one place. And also the library in the short story, The Library of Babel, which is an infinite library, or effectively infinite. It contains a book with like every possible combination of letters. So most of them are nonsense, but there's some gems in there, but you could spend your whole life looking for them. So I think that these ideas that like, as your knowledge increases, the ability to navigate it becomes more important, and especially the ability to make connections between seemingly disparate subjects that are sort of intimately related. I think that idea was very connected to the subject matter of Ada. It's like, that's kind of what ethics is in a way, or at least when we're trying to like, plan for the future and predict the future, it's like pulling from things that seem unrelated and making sense of them. And it's also just kind of, it's related to our times. We're on the internet. The librarians are bad. They're reinforcing our preconceptions instead of leading us on to new things. And by the librarians are bad, I mean like the YouTube algorithm and stuff. So had the character, had the setting. Tonally, I think there's a lot of cool speculative fiction in the form of novels that is aesthetically distinct from the tropes of science fiction. So I was looking at work by Margaret Atwood, Octavia Butler, Ursula Le Guin, and Kim Stanley Robinson too, that sort of have this quality. Like when I read The Handmaid's Tale, I think like what really struck me about it was that it did not have like Obviously, it's very dystopian, but it did not have sort of dystopian vibes. Like it was very much the inner experience of someone whose day-to-day, mostly consisted of staring at a wall, punctuated by terror and grief. But like a lot of it was like descriptions of the colors she's seeing and like the sensations she's having. And I thought that quality is really cool and really distinct from a lot of what we see in dystopian or futuristic works. And same for those other authors I listed, all have an element of that. Like The Left Hand of Darkness is inarguably sci-fi, right? It's like an emissary goes to another planet to observe their culture, but it's all about the weather, It's just like snow and romantic vibes. And yeah, it's very interesting. It has this like medieval feel, even though it's visiting other planets in the future. So yeah, just kind of drawing from all of that and then figuring out how to translate that into a look that would feel handmade and lush and kind of like intimate too, I guess. So in terms of visual references, we were looking at a lot of cartoon saloon films like Wolfwalkers, Song of the Sea, which have this sort of highly illustrated style and this really fun shape design of like really bulbous, exaggerated shapes, as well as like some of the concept art from Samurai Jack, which obviously it's a show that combines future and past and has these sort of very vivid landscapes with like very exaggerated shapes. And yeah, so like looking at references like that and trying to find a version of that we could do with our budget. Also, I knew I wanted it to be super chatty, but I think super voiceover driven films are kind of polarizing. Like there's a lot of people who think that is just bad and you shouldn't do it. I completely disagree. But I was studying up on like the films that are like that I love to see how they did it and how we could translate that into an educational voice. So like The Danish Poet, which is an animated short that actually won an Oscar, was a big inspiration there. The next and like less fun part is to come up with a pipeline that we're going to be able to do this with the time and money we have. And I think animation is a lot more technical of a process than people realize. So we went with 3D animation for the characters and 2D illustrated backgrounds that were painted in Photoshop. And the way 3D character animation works is basically you go from a drawing, a character design, to essentially sculpting it inside the computer, like making what's called a 3D model. But then you have to build it a skeleton, apply constraints to the skeleton so like the knees bend the right way and stuff, apply weights to the skin so the right joints tug on the skin in the right way, and then build an interface that is like controls for someone to actually use that and animate it. So there's all this kind of knowledge of anatomy and physics and stuff like that goes into it. So yeah, we decided on this 3D pipeline for the characters because a more traditional like style where you redraw the characters every frame is just a lot slower, and it's also difficult to keep consistent with a group of different animators, especially because most animators now, even who work in that style, are not used to doing it in that way and like staying on model and keeping like the volume of the limbs and stuff consistent and the line of the stroke and stuff. So there was like a lot of pipeline dev work that happened before we went into production. And like kind of in parallel to that, I was drafting scripts and sort of figuring out how long they should be, what the vibes were going to be, like all that kind of stuff. A lot of the scripts I drafted in that period did not become episodes, or were heavily edited before they became episodes. But in order to go into production, what we needed was a locked script of episode 1. So I think, and this is a big difference between animation and live action, is that it's not coming together in the editing phase. You really want every shot carefully defined up front because every second of animation is expensive and you don't want to be doing stuff that you don't need. It's not like, you can just shoot a bunch of B-roll and mess around with it later. Like you really don't want to be doing that.
Not so much improvising on the set from actors in an animated movie.
Yeah. No improvising. Yeah. So although still more improvising than maybe we would like, because with every step of the process, you go from the script to the recorded audio to a storyboard to a sort of roughly blocked animation to a complete animation. With every one of those major steps, it adds another layer of interpretation that makes you see the story in a different way or see other elements that aren't working. because each time it's a different person.
So audio before the storyboard?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I would have guessed the other way around.
Well, kind of in parallel, like once the script is locked, we would start doing like doing a rough pass of the storyboard in parallel to recording the audio and making selections from the takes. And I say locked script, but especially in the first episode, I was rewriting a lot of lines kind of on the fly in the recording session because, when the actor says them, they come to life in a different way. But yeah, it's really important to get the audio and the selects done because it doesn't really come together until you put that rough storyboard thumbnails to the audio and start figuring out the timing. And that's what we call a boardomatic. It's just the storyboard set to the timing. And at that very rough stage, that is when we would show it to the larger team, like the animators and the illustrators, and kind of get their reactions to it, like what parts weren't clear, and then go back and really refine the storyboards. And you really want every shot to be defined in the storyboards. You want someone to be able to interpret the emotion, the character's pose, where the camera is, how close it is, all that kind of stuff. Because I think, again, with animation, because it's expensive, you're trying to catch issues at earliest stage as possible. So when that storyboard, you don't go directly from there to fully animating it. First, you do a blocking pass, which is just where are the characters, where is the camera, maybe one or two poses, and then try to catch as many things as possible there. Or if someone's confused about what the emotion should be in a scene or in a shot, try to figure that out there. And so then from there, you go on to a sort of complete character animation pass. And I guess the other thing to note is that you have to make absolutely everything that's going to appear. So with each episode, once that script is getting close to final, we're making a list of props and characters that we don't have, and those are being modeled in 3D. We're making a list of the backgrounds we need, which are being painted in 2D, and kind of proceeding from there. So we're updating the edit with new shots every day because, again, trying to catch any timing issues that come. And it's also, we were on a really tight schedule. We had 8 or 9 weeks for animation for every episode, which is probably a number that's kind of meaningless if you don't work in animation. But what that translated to was the highest daily quota of seconds of animation that any of our animators had ever worked with. So it was super important to track every day what was being done, because even things, going a little astray could lead to big costs and delays. But yeah, so once the animation is all finished, you're still looking at something that's not pretty because it hasn't been rendered and composited.
Right.
So yeah, that process of rendering from 3D is translating the model to a final look and feel. And that can mean different things. It can be super realistic, super simple. It can have lighting and shadow and all these different passes. But we went with a really simple, flat color and no lighting from 3D because we wanted it to have that sort of closer to traditional 2D feel. And then at that point, you have to put it all together with the backgrounds and little effects and things, and that's called compositing. And then finally, we have the timing's locked. Hopefully it's locked before this, and that's the point at which sound design and music can take place.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, yeah. From my perspective, it's it looks beautiful. I'm hoping, given all that work, you're very happy with how it came out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm already the next thing's gonna be so much better.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I am. Yeah. I am super happy with how it came out. Yeah.
It does seem especially hard to remove yourself to the point of someone seeing it for the first time when you are spending so much time on every second of this thing. It's and being so immersed in it.
Yeah, and I mean, definitely that was kind of my job, was to keep track of the big picture and ways in which we were possibly straying from the creative vision, because I wasn't as deeply in the weeds. I was not animating shots myself, so that helps keep some degree of perspective. But yeah, and also we would start one phase for the next episode as soon as it was done for each episode. So I would be working on 3 episodes at once. I'd be writing one, giving intensive feedback on the storyboarding of one, and reviewing the later stages of animating on another. So it's a lot to float around in the brain at one time.
Right. Yeah. So you directed these episodes too, right?
Yeah.
Does that encompass storyboarding and giving direction to the actors? Or?
I did not do any storyboarding. No.
Okay.
But the reviewing of the storyboards was super intensive, and where we were making a lot of decisions about story, like sometimes going back and tweaking the script, which was something I really wanted to make sure we did, because I think it works best when the two are informing each other instead of just getting passed on from phase to phase without any dialogue, which is sometimes how things end up being produced just because of, various constraints.
What's been the hardest part of this whole process for you personally?
For me personally, definitely managing creative work and the business and management end. I think just because doing good creative work takes a lot of time and space, and yes, you can block X hours a day to work on this, but a lot of times what you need to do is block a whole day and fuck around and pace and lie on your bed and just let it percolate. And that is just wildly incompatible with managing a brand new organization.
Yeah, with running the studio.
Both from the people and fundraising and relationship management aspects. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it feels like obviously funding constraint, but if you could, it feels like it's at least 2 jobs, right? Or ideally.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But I think, well, first of all, I should say I was not doing our production manager was doing an amazing job of tracking the budget and paying the contractors and figuring out all our project management stuff. I was not doing any of that stuff hands-on. But even just I think fundraising could be one whole person's job. Yeah. And I also, I would have liked to be able to hire writers for Ada and hand it off. And we trialed a bunch of people who were all really good writers in certain ways, but it was really hard to find the right fit for this project. And I think, if we were doing more episodes, there are pieces of both the creative and business side I could much more easily hand off than in that beginning stage. But also I was not the only person doing 3 jobs. Pretty much everyone was doing 3 jobs.
I'm sure there are many, but is there one big unexpected challenge that seemed like was the most challenging thing for your team along the way?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, there was. Yeah, there was one big disaster that we resolved very well, but it was a disaster to start. Yeah.
People love disasters, so let's go.
Yeah. I've said we chose a 3D pipeline for the character animation because we thought it was sort of the most cost-effective way to achieve the quality standard we were looking for. Actually, for episode 1, we did 3D characters in the real world and hand-drawn characters in the imagined world. So drawn frame by frame. And we were kind of we were already building the tracks as we were riding the train, right? Getting our pipelines into place and all the other parts we needed once we were already in production, in some cases. So everyone was already felt like we were at the limit of what we could do, but it just became really clear by the end of it. We'd gone so far beyond schedule and over budget that it was okay, we have to change this pipeline. We can't keep doing this. So we switched to a 3D pipeline for the Imagined World 2, which might seem like an easy switch, but we had to redesign and build, model, and rig all the characters for that imagined world, which are super important steps because the quality of the rig, which again is the skeleton and the controllers for it, basically, that determines the quality of animation that the animators can get. And if it's not good, it creates tons of problems down the line. So we had to do that. That also meant completely redefining the art direction and rendering style for the imagined world and thinking about how having that much more to render from 3D would impact that part of our production timeline for each episode. And it was just really nerve-wracking because we kind of had to do this without breaking step, change the whole thing without, again, as we were doing it. And again, feeling as if we were already completely maxed out. And I think it wasn't really until we were 2/3 of the way through episode 3 that it was clear that episode 3 was actually coming in a little bit under budget and this switch had worked and was equalizing out. So yeah, that was the biggest challenge for sure. But it worked. And I think the series is much better because of it. And I think, the desire to try the hand-drawn thing at all was definitely driven by all of our attachment to the art and the craft of it.
Yeah,
because
right.
I hired people for this project who feel similarly to how I do about that element of it. And yeah, definitely we're letting the feelings drive in that particular decision and paid for it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Do you have any hopes and dreams for, so people watch Ada, they love it. They watch every episode, every minute. Do you have like specific hopes and dreams for what happens next for them, in terms of like how far away they might be from changing their career or changing their donations? Or is it like very much this early stages thing of like, I just want people to grapple with questions in this area, and then like maybe this is like the first domino, and we'll come back in 3 years and we'll find out that like people have a similar story about Ada as you do with that short film?
I mean, I think that's the dream. I would love that. And I would love for people to actually start working on some of the big questions that are raised in the episodes. I mean, for me, maybe the subject I'm most passionate about the ones in these 5 episodes, is artificial wombs. And I would definitely like to see that subject get de-weirded and the sort of visceral ick that a lot of people have to it decrease. And also, with that one, I would really love to kind of make the point that the ethical questions they raise already exist with the level of reproductive technologies we have, and not making artificial wombs is not going to prevent these questions from needing to be solved or from causing big problems. And I definitely noticed a trend of talking about technologies that have the potential to prevent a lot of suffering or do a lot of good. The people who are thinking about them almost seem to hold them to a higher standard of pursuing this and making this. It's like, well, how will we make sure everyone has access? And it's like, well, at first, everyone won't have access. That's the same it's been with literally every innovation ever, right? But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
So you talked earlier about different theories of change, like depending on the episodes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would you like to like pick any of the others and go through them and say like, okay, for this episode, here was my specific theory of change, or like hopes and dreams for how people would react to it?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the AI one is kind of an interesting example. In my head, I had this idea that it would be useful to have a piece on AI that was sort of a boring apocalypse. Like, everyone has good intentions, the uses seem kind of mundane, everything goes to shit anyway. In my mind, I had kind of like people who are skeptical of some of the claims that AI safety is important, like the semi-informed skeptics, I guess, when coming up with that plot line. I think for gene drives, I guess where I landed with that one was that even if the technical stuff was going by you, the kind of central question there is about playing God, which is a concept everyone's familiar with, right? It's well-trodden fiction terrain. And I guess the question posed by the episode that I think is a little different is like, do we ever have an ethical obligation or a moral obligation to play God? So I think you could get a lot of that core stuff, even if the science was flying over your head. And then another thing I think is that the way, especially in something that's sort of episodic in a way that Ada has a slight overarching plot, but each of the episodes can be watched alone. And based on the way people consume content online, I expect that they will be watched alone. So kind of keeping that in mind too, it's sort of okay if each episode is reaching slightly different audiences. Like, you also have to assume that there will be people stumbling on individual episodes in isolation.
Yep. One we haven't covered yet is the kidney donation episode. Yeah. Did you have a clear hopes and dreams for how that was going to land?
Yeah, that one was a little interesting because I think I was most at risk of getting sidetracked from my sort of guiding stars of mission for the thing and into like practical calls to action. But interestingly, the kidney episode was the most beloved of my team. And I think it's because of this like strong emotional arc. And it's also when I have a personal connection to. My grandfather was on dialysis for 5 years, and sort of seeing up close the kind of horrendous suffering that entails, but also his sort of will to live when confronted with, it's basically like every third day your blood goes through the machine. So it's like you get one good day. I'm doing good in air quotes because it's still not full health, to 2 bad days. And that's just it forever, with like no hope of ever coming off that. So that was definitely like part of my motivation for wanting to do it. It's interesting because to me, the idea of paying kidney donors doesn't seem radical. It seems like it makes total sense. I think there are a lot of really compelling arguments there. But because it's such a like cultural meme of like, you know, selling a kidney to do X, Y, or Z, right? It is going to be provocative no matter what. Even though I think the tone of that one is sort of more personal, more emotional, less overtly provocative than some of the others.
Yeah. Did you see that recently there was a news piece where I'm not exactly sure of the details, but there is a proposal now on the table for like a $50,000 credit for kidney donors.
Yes. Very exciting.
So yeah, I was wondering if that if you read that thinking like, I don't know, both like I am very happy that that's happening and also like, oh, it would have been nice if that happened 3 months after my episode came out.
Okay, so this is the thing about animation. It's slow. So I know I'm not going to be breaking news here. That's part of why I think it's a good medium for exploring evergreen topics in particular. And definitely also that partially informed the choices of what to focus on. Like, what do I think will continue to be relevant or continue to be a point of contention or discussion about this topic?
Another point is that it also felt like the episodes very often ended with this message of like, this stuff is really hard to think about, where you could have gone in the other direction and try to have the message be at the end. Actually, it's like surprisingly easy to do a lot of good. Yeah, how conscious was that decision?
So I think for the topics of the episodes, it is very hard to think about them, and it is not that easy to do good. And so I wanted to acknowledge that. But I would also sort of characterize the message they land on a little bit differently. So I think Ada's journey in every episode is that her views get complexified as the episodes go on. But they don't land on a place of this is impossible. They end on a place of like introspection, and I underestimated the complexity of this when I went charging in at the beginning of the episode. But she keeps coming back for more. Like, she's not totally discouraged. And I think that the ideas in the realm of more, it's actually surprisingly easy to do good. They're very compelling once you hear them. But for me, what was most compelling and inspiring was in the sort of school of EA ideas was the acknowledgement of the uncertainty and murkiness and dense webs of causality and things, and the acknowledgement of the difficulty in untangling some of that and the uncertainty that persists, but trying to do it anyway. And so because that was the thing that was, for me, most inspiring, that was what I wanted to sort of repeatedly acknowledge in the episodes themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know earlier you said that, you weren't having this goal of like, this is going to be like explicitly like effective altruism-y. But then you also mentioned in our chats preparing for this, that you did have this maximizing impact thing in your head as you were going through a lot of the smaller decisions. Yeah, do you want to talk through that? Like, how central was that concept, and maybe give us some specific examples?
Yeah, I mean, completely central in ways that'll probably sound a little bit insane. But because the goal was to reach people who are not science fiction fans and are probably put off, if they have heard about these topics, are put off by the way they're discussed, the sort of aesthetics, everything from kind of art direction to character design to music and sound to the performance of the characters to the tone of the writing to the tone of the voice acting, all of that is sort of essential to think through really carefully for creating a counterpoint to the aesthetic of traditional science fiction. In the storyboards for episode 1, and we were also kind of doing an animation test prototype to sort of figure out Ada's body language and acting and stuff, there was this pose that kept coming up in the first storyboards I got back that was like her with her hands on her hips. And to me, this was just like nails on a chalkboard, like the most sort of, grating thing, but in a way that I thought would be like off-putting to a lot of women in particular. Like, oh, like, look at this cutesy, sassy girl. So basically I banned hands on hips as a pose. And I think that was probably like the smallest decision that was made explicitly with impact in mind. But yeah, a lot of decisions were made in that way. Even things that seem, kind of frivolous or that you maybe wouldn't think about that much, like her outfit, right, was trying to strike a very particular tone of, I don't know, like definitely not sexy assassin in skin-tight leather pants and a crop top, which has been applied to, like, you know, alarmingly young girls in media historically, but also not like, here is a big nerd doing big nerd things. Like, she has her own kind of unique style that matches her personality, sort of loud and wacky, but it's not, we were working really hard not to make it tropey. I mean, the grumpy librarian's a trope, so fine, but I think it's a nice trope. But that definitely holds true around a lot of like the choices we were making around characters and how to portray them.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. Yeah, so we talked about this a bit earlier, being like incredibly difficult to actually track the total impact of a project like this. Do you have some idea of how you could begin to track its impact?
Yeah, okay, so this is very much anecdata, right? Like, prior to it being distributed, we've been submitting it to festivals and screening it in festivals, and wherever possible, I've been attending those festivals, which has been my first opportunity to see it with an audience, and possibly my last, given the way people watch things and them being online and you not having that interface with the viewer. So again, these are very inexact signals, but getting into festivals is good. Getting awards in festivals is good, which we have a few. But especially like when I go to the screenings, I kind of like sit in the back and don't watch the film. I watch the audience and like see, because you really get a feeling in the room of like how it's landing with people, what parts people are responding to. Like, one moment I had was the people sitting directly in front of me in a screening of the Artificial Wombs episode, like as the credits were rolling, were like debating some of the points in the episode with each other, and I was like, yes,
oh, nice,
perfect, it's doing its job. But once it's like out, once it's released, where available, data like views and retention and mentions of it are valuable signals. But I also think with media projects, there's always an element of the judgment call, because, you know, these kinds of accolades or views or whatever, they can be a signal that something is good and it's making an impact, but the absence of them doesn't necessarily mean it isn't, because there's so much sort of volatility and randomness in this stuff, and the fact that, you know, it might still be landing really well with people who are seeing it. So I do try to kind of keep that in mind.
I know that you didn't cover all of the topics and possible worlds that you wish you could have for Ada. So yeah, are there any that stand out as being like would have been particularly exciting or sad that you haven't been able to cover it yet?
Yeah, I think there's a couple that stand out, and then I think there's also many more I have not discovered yet. I think the one that's sort of like most strange to me that didn't make it in and that I would definitely do next is the whole brain emulation digital people one, because that was sort of, for me, the whole catalyst for starting to think about this stuff. So it's kind of funny that it that it didn't make it in. I would also love to do one on performance enhancing drugs, specifically like sort of non-traditional definitions of that. So I'm not talking about like for sports. I'm talking about like cognitive performance enhancing drugs and things like that. And I just think that it could get so wacky and so fun. And similar to the gene drives, like, do we have an obligation to play God? Like, do we have an obligation to take performance enhancing drugs is one I'm super into. Other topics of interest, I would love to do one from like the perspective, you know, Ada imagining what it's like to live in an intergalactic civilization and what her experience is like there as still, you know, one person on one world. And then there are a couple more policy ones I would love to do too. I would love to do an open immigration one, and I maybe like less urgently am interested in exploring one on charter cities.
Did you start off with a clear goal for distribution, you know, how it was going to be released? And yeah, how has that progressed throughout the process?
I was really trying to make the goal, get this in front of as many people as possible. And sometimes like the most, you know, prestigious or nice on paper distribution isn't ideal for that. Like, it's actually not great to be on Netflix if you're buried on Netflix.
Yeah.
And a lot of streamers prioritize, you know, some of them still do licensing and acquisitions, but understandably like prioritize their own in-house productions in terms of what they push. So I didn't really know where I wanted it to land, but I wanted it to be able to work in a variety of places.
So yeah, can you say like some examples of like, yeah, you want it to work in a few different mediums ways? Yeah, what are you thinking of there?
Yeah, so 11 minutes, which is effectively the length of the episodes, is like a standard TV block. Like usually you see them to 11 minutes put together into a 22 or half hour slot. So that's like kind of a traditional TV format. A lot of that is sort of irrelevant on streamers, like where anthology collections like Love, Death, and Robots on Netflix, like some of them are 3 minutes, some of them are half an hour. And so a lot is like shifting and changing about that. But the hope was that it could work for those formats if we wanted to go that route. And then it's also a really nice length for YouTube. And this is getting a little into the weeds, but I think part of the reason stuff in the kind of like, let's say 8 to 15 minute range does so well on YouTube is that part of what goes into the YouTube algorithm is retention, which they define as the number of people watching until the end. And part of it is just absolute watch time, like not normalized for video length. So I think 11 minutes is kind of like in that sweet spot of optimizing for both of those things. Like short videos can really get punished by the YouTube algorithm. So we were thinking if it did end up there, then we wanted it to be a good length. And also, I think very early on, I'd had this idea of doing more and shorter episodes. And with animation, it really is a trade-off of more and shorter, fewer and longer, because the cost scales really directly with the number of seconds of animation. And I just found that was kind of like the minimum length that could do these subjects anything approaching justice.
Yeah, no, that would be my take as well. Naively, I would have maybe guessed that just putting them on YouTube would have been the way to maximize viewers. But it's more complicated than that?
I think it is more complicated than that. I think just putting it on YouTube as someone who does not already have a following and a channel on YouTube it's much more difficult to make that go well than I think people imagine.
Yeah.
Although it is true that you can essentially just buy views, but they're not going to be quality views. And it's not that when I say I wanted as many people to see it as possible, I don't mean I want a high number of views. I mean, I want people to actually see it and watch it. So I think like also having worked on a big YouTube channel in the past, I had a little more of an understanding of like what's hard about that. And also all the parts of that I didn't want to do. But I do think that like you're onto something in that it's just like sort of funny. A lot of commissioners and distributors I pitched were like asking creators to help them solve the problem of discoverability of the content.
Right.
It's like that's why people want you to do that part for them. So it's definitely there's definitely like a lot of turmoil and sort of flux going on right now, both with like how people find things, where they watch them, what they watch, like what are the different formats even anymore. So it's an interesting time.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, where can listeners watch Ada?
Yeah, so Ada will be available on TED-Ed's YouTube channel in early January. And in the meantime, you can watch the trailer and see updates on theatrical screenings at shouldwestudio.com. Also, for anyone in New York, we're screening at the Regal Theater in Union Square on Saturday, December 7th. And that's part of the Dances with Films Festival.
Cool. All right. So you've been so generous with your time, but we're coming towards the end of the interview. But for any listeners, maybe especially younger listeners, who have hopes and dreams of being creative writers, do you have anything you want to say to those people?
Yeah, I think the first thing for anyone who wants to do creative work, obviously it has a reputation for not being easy to get into. And in particular, that like junior creative roles are totally, you're totally fungible because there's so many people who want to do them. And I think like given that, when you do get one, it's sort of easy to feel like, oh, I'm really lucky to have this job. But the reality is, if you're doing a good job, they are also lucky to have you, because I think like the perspective you don't get is that, hiring is a time-consuming and inexact science. And even when there's a lot of people vying for a job, that doesn't mean it's easy to get a good person. And once you have one, you really want to keep them. And I think like people in early career creative roles in particular, like don't self-advocate as much as they should because of this dynamic that they feel is there. And you really do have to in order to progress, which, is a whole other kind of bad. But yeah, so I think that's sort of like the first thing to know. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Do you have any like generalizable advice for people who might be pursuing a creative career of any kind? Doesn't have to necessarily be creative writing.
Yeah, I mean, I think again with creative careers, just sort of because of the dynamics of how many people want to do them and what opportunities are available, it is sort of really important to be able to advocate for yourself. But I also think that sounds more intimidating than it is, and I think a lot of creative people are, maybe shy and sensitive, which I am too. But like, you don't have to have the personality of like a Shark Tank contestant to be effective at networking. Like, if everyone you work with enjoys working with you, that's networking. If you are talking to your peers and, just generally talking about the stuff you're interested in, your hopes and dreams, like, that's networking, because sooner than you think they're going to be sort of your peers will be in decision-making positions and positions of power, or your friends might find things that aren't the right fit for them, but they pass on to you. So like, don't be intimidated by the kind of hustle aspect of it, because there are ways to do it that can suit any personality type. And if sort of interviewing or public speaking or whatever is a sticking point, which again, I feel like it is for a lot of creative people, I think the way to approach that is to just find a way to be able to speak in your own words, like translate what you have to do into a way that sounds natural to you, rather than trying to sort of imitate presentation speak or job interview speak or whatever. So yeah, basically I think anyone can do these things effectively with a little practice, and like do practice saying things out loud if you're going to have to say them and you're scared to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess like the other thing is you just do have to pitch the right idea to the right person at the right time. And there's sort of no taking out that element of luck. But I think to maximize the chance that happens, kind of the most important thing you can do is just keep making stuff and pursue things that interest you or that you think are important, even if it's not immediately obvious how they're going to convert into, a product that's ready for the world or even anyone other than you to see. And just like keep pursuing those interests, keep making stuff, keep finding out where they go. And then you'll be ready if the right opportunity does come along to pitch it.
Nice. Yeah. Anything else in the advice category?
I also think for writers, it's important and maybe counterintuitive to get critique partners or beta readers who are themselves working in the same genre or format or age group as you. That's something I didn't do for a long time. Like, I just picked people I knew were good writers or editors to read stuff in kind of unrelated genres. And it was just much less effective than kind of joining a group of people who were trying to write similar things. And because they're all kind of like immersed in the craft and conventions of whether it's like fantasy or whatever. Yeah. And then for artists, like, your portfolio matters more than anything else. So have a few really solid things rather than a bunch of stuff, and like make things in the discipline you want to get a job in. Like, I hear surprisingly often from people who want to be a storyboard artist, but all their portfolio is all like background illustration or, similar mismatch. So yeah, definitely have a few really solid things in whatever the thing is you want to do, a few solid pieces. And then like get advice from someone who's just a few years older than you or a few years further along in their career and has the job you want to have. Like, people who have gone through it less recently are going to have less relevant advice. So like, you don't have to find like the most senior person you can get to answer your email to give you advice. Like, just find someone who has the job you want to have next and ask them how they got it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. Yeah, well, I guess as a final question, you wrote to me that your chaotic trait is reading the entire Wikipedia plot summary for a novel I've just started. And I gotta say, me and my wife are so allergic to spoilers that this just struck me as being completely bonkers. So do you care to defend this insanity?
Yeah, I mean, you're not the only people who think it's bonkers. Like, definitely I have friends and colleagues who won't even watch trailers for things.
Me too.
But okay, so for me, it's not about what happens. It's about how it happens. And like, any plot does not sound interesting as a plot summary. So I don't really feel that it spoils anything for me. And I think, I think execution is everything. Like, there's a reason you can't copyright ideas. But even like as a consumer of stories, I viscerally feel that. I just don't feel that it really spoils anything for me. And I'll do this with like museum exhibits too. I'll like dash through the whole thing and then go back to the beginning and go through it at a normal pace. But I do think like part of it is like maybe slightly pathological. I cannot turn off the part of me that's curious about how is this particular sausage made. Like, I can't turn off the part that's like thinking about like how different things were achieved and how they're going to get from A to B and like, oh, I see, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, reading and watching movies and TV shows is like not really a great way to relax for me, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because I think if I get something spoiled, I can definitely still be with you and have the same experience of really enjoying it. And on this more like technical level of like, oh, well, how are they going to do this? Or even, I mean, this happens more naturally if you watch something for a second time. But yeah, I feel like you're giving up this extra experience, which I guess I'm having that you might not, which is just for sort of losing yourself in this world and being genuinely surprised and that having its own, producing emotions. If you're, you're in the moment, you're immersed in the film. If you can forget you're watching a film, I think that is kind of a sign of success. It's like, all right, the filmmakers have done their job. If you forget there's just a screen in front of you, but that if you read the entire plot summary, I feel like you can't have that experience.
Yeah, I feel like I can't have that experience anymore anyway. But I will say that reading the plot summary, it creates like a different kind of anticipation for me. Like, if you know someone's going to die and there's like this tender moment, you're like, ah! And like, but look, I'm not going to argue that this isn't weird compulsive behavior. I think part of it is also probably because I'm highly susceptible to imaginary worlds. And like, I think I started doing this because like, it's really hard for me to just not like watch the entire show or read the entire book/series and like not do anything until I finish it, which is, not super viable
right.
maybe was viable when I was like 17 or whatever, but not now. So like, a way to like soothe the compulsion that I can do in 5 minutes instead of taking my whole day is just to like read what happens. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think actually that makes perfect sense. Yeah. If your two options are like, look, I am going to compulsively binge watch this thing. That's going to be my next 3 days. Or I sort of scratch the itch and then I'll come back to my leisure. Yeah. Hey, that might be better for the world.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been a delight. My guest today has been Elizabeth Cox. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks. It's been super fun.
All right. Just a reminder that you'll be able to find Elizabeth's show Ada for free online via TED's YouTube channel in early January. In the meantime, you can watch the trailer and see upcoming theatrical screenings on shouldwestudio.com. And Keiran just put out the pilot script and a 10-episode outline for his show Bequest on the Effective Altruism Forum if you want to check that out. There are links for those in the show notes for this episode. All right, the 80,000 Hours podcast is produced by Keiran Harris. Additional content editing by myself and Katie Moore. Audio engineering by Ben Cordell, Mila McGuire, Simon Mansour, and Dominic Armstrong. Full transcripts and an extensive collection of links to learn more are available on our site and put together, as always, by Katie Moore. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.